The sun was sliding low behind the buttes when Elias Boone first heard the riders coming. The sound reached him through the dry wind, a rhythmic drumming that trembled the dust at his boots and stirred something old in his chest. He paused his work at the corral, the hammer loose in his hand, eyes narrowing against the dying light. 3 Apache horsemen crested the rise, their ponies lean and restless. The lead rider, a man with a scar across his cheek and eyes as calm as storm water, lifted a hand in greeting that felt more like a warning. Elias nodded, his body aching with the weariness of both age and season. He'd been short on feed and shorter on hope these past months, and the sight of trade, any trade, carried a kind of salvation he no longer believed in. When they dismounted, dust lifted around them like ghosts. The leader introduced himself in halting English as Tajo and gestured toward 2 paint horses tethered behind them. "Strong, fast. For food, salt, powder," he said. Elias scratched his beard, studying the animals. They were good stock, sound, except for one that favored its right foreleg. "That one's gone lame," he said, nodding to it. Tajo's jaw tightened. The other men spoke in low tones among themselves. Then Tajo turned, calling sharply behind him. From among their number stepped a woman, her head bowed beneath a faded red shawl. "She owes tribe," Tajo said flatly. "She work. Cook, clean. Balance the trade." Elias's stomach turned. "I don't need trade stands," Tajo interrupted. His gaze was firm, and behind it, a silence sharp enough to cut. "Or no horses." The desert wind carried the smell of rain, iron and sage. Elias looked from the horses to the woman, slender, unmoving, the shawl hiding all but her mouth. He could have refused. He could have sent them away and faced another month with nothing but debt and rattling hunger. But the weariness was stronger than pride. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll take the trade," Tajo inclined his head. "She good worker," he said, though his voice held neither praise nor warmth. The men untied the horses, exchanged a few sacks of grain, and within minutes were riding back into the red horizon. Elias stood in the settling dust, the woman beside him like a shadow he hadn't asked for. The sun slipped beneath the land, and night came with a chill that bit through his coat. He gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside, then." She followed without a word. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. A single lamp burned on the table, throwing its light across old tools and a chipped coffee pot. Elias dropped his hat on the peg by the door and poured himself a tin cup of water. The woman remained near the threshold, her shawl drawn close. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't answer. He tried again, slower. "You understand me?" Still nothing. Her eyes, dark as wet stone, flicked briefly toward him, then away. Not fearful, not defiant, just unreadable. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "Bed's in the corner. You can use the cot by the stove." He busied himself with the fire, tossing in another log, the flames licking up like old anger. He felt her presence behind him, silent as the wind pressing at the shutters. He made a pot of beans, set 2 bowls out, and ate without looking at her. After a long time, he heard a faint clink, the sound of her spoon touching the metal bowl he'd left for her. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. The sound filled the small cabin, mingling with the low crackle of the fire. Outside, the horses shifted in the pen. Inside, 2 strangers shared a meal without trust, without words, only the brittle truce of necessity. Later, Elias sat in his chair by the fire, the old rifle leaning against the hearth. The lamplight painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. Across from him, the woman, the payment, sat cross-legged on the floor, her shawl still over her shoulders. He studied her in silence. The shawl was frayed at the edges, the red dulled by sun and dust. Her hands, resting on her knees, bore calluses like his own. He wanted to ask who she was before the trade, a wife, a daughter, a widow perhaps. But the question felt like trespass. So he said nothing. Instead, his gaze wandered to the mantel where a single photograph leaned against a cracked cup. His late wife Mary stared back at him from the past, eyes kind, smile small. The ache of that image pressed heavy against his ribs. The woman's voice startled him when it finally came. "Fire need wood." He blinked, unsure he'd heard right. Her English was quiet, the words shaped with care. "I'll tend it," he said, and reached for the poker. But she was already rising, moving with unhurried grace. She added 2 logs, stirred the coals, then settled back, saying nothing more. For a long time, they watched the flames climb and twist, throwing their shadows against the walls. The storm outside thickened, rain drumming, wind moaning through the seams. Elias felt the weight of the day in his bones. Yet beneath the fatigue was something else, a stirring unease, as if the air between them held more truth than either dared touch. When he finally rose, he said simply, "Turn in when you're ready." She didn't reply, but her eyes followed him as he moved to his narrow bed. He lay staring at the rafters, listening to the rain. Every creak of the wood sounded like memory. Every drop against the roof like a voice he'd buried years ago. Sleep came slow. He thought of her, of the way she'd stood in the stormlight when the riders left, small but unyielding, like a tree clinging to dry ground. Somewhere in the dark, the fire popped. The woman shifted on the cot, 2 souls adrift in the same silence, bound by nothing but the thin mercy of shelter. Outside, the land exhaled under the weight of rain. Inside, the man and the woman, strangers, survivors, each carrying unseen scars, waited out the storm of their own making. And though neither would have said it aloud, both knew something had already changed. The cabin had become not just a refuge from the storm, but a place where ghosts had stirred, and would soon demand to be faced. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them chose. Morning light came pale through the warped window panes, spilling across the rough-hewn boards of the cabin floor. Elias rose before dawn as he always had, brewing bitter coffee over the embers and stepping out into the chill to tend the stock. Tessa followed without being told. She wore the same faded shawl each day, its red muted by dust, her dark braid trailing down her back like a scar made of hair. She moved with quiet certainty, the kind born of people who listened to the wind before taking a step. Elias noticed how the horses calmed under her hand, how even the skittish colt that had bloodied 2 of his men last year stood still when she whispered to it. He didn't ask what words she spoke. They weren't meant for him. She mended the fences, patched the roof, and carried water from the well with a steadiness that shamed his own slowing body. She rarely met his eyes. When she did, he saw not fear, but something older, patience perhaps, or sorrow tempered into strength. At night, they ate in silence. He'd sit by the hearth with his coffee, watching firelight dance along the rifle that leaned against the stone wall, his late wife's rifle, Mary's. He hadn't moved it since she passed 2 winters ago. The cabin still bore her traces, a shawl draped over the chair, a bit of embroidery half finished on the table, her hairbrush resting beside a cracked mirror. Elias had kept those things as proof that she had been real, proof that he'd once been a man who smiled. Tessa never touched them, until the day she did. It was near sunset when he found her inside, standing by the hearth with the rifle in her hands. She'd taken a rag from the table and was cleaning the barrel with careful, practiced movements. The gesture froze him in place. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked. She turned slowly. Her eyes didn't flinch from his anger. "It was dirty," she said simply. His pulse quickened. "You had no right to touch that." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing more. The fire popped between them. For a moment, Elias felt something close to fear, not of her, but of the way she looked at him unblinking, as though she could see straight through his anger to the hollow space behind it. He took the rifle from her hands, a little too roughly. "Don't touch my things," he muttered. She stepped back, calm and unashamed. "You keep it for the dead," she said softly. "But the dead don't need iron." The words struck him like a thrown stone. Before he could answer, she turned away, resumed her work near the table, and left him standing there with ghosts crawling up his spine. That night, Elias drank more than he should. The rain returned, a thin drizzle that whispered against the roof like old regrets. He sat in the chair by the fire, until the world blurred around him. In the flicker of the flames, he saw Mary's face. He heard her laughter in the echo of the wind. When he woke, the fire was out. A blanket covered his shoulders, one that wasn't his. Morning came with a bruised sky. The land smelled of damp earth and juniper. Tessa was already outside, mending the gate where the hinge had split. Elias joined her, the silence between them sharp as barbed wire. "You spoke to me yesterday," he said finally. "Your English is good," she nodded once, hammering a nail into the wood. "Why didn't you use it before?" She looked up then, meeting his eyes. "Words are not always safe." He studied her face. "Safe from who?" She turned back to the gate. "From those who listen only to themselves." He had no answer for that. The wind swept through the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and the faint, distant sound of coyotes. For the first time, Elias wondered what she had endured before the day she was traded. The thought unsettled him. He had taken her presence as an inconvenience, a living reminder of his failures. But now, seeing her there beneath the endless sky, he felt the uneasy stirrings of respect. When the work was done, she sat by the corral fence, watching the horizon. Elias joined her without asking. The silence was different now, not empty, but full of something unspoken. He passed her a cup of coffee. She accepted it, holding it between her palms like a small fire. After a long time, she said quietly, "My name is Tessa." He nodded. "Elias." She gave a faint smile, the first he had seen from her. "I know," she said. He frowned. "You knew my name?" "I listened," she replied. He wanted to ask what else she'd heard, what she thought of his muttering, his anger, his quiet conversations with the dead. But the question stayed unspoken. Some truths didn't need voices. That evening, as the sun bled into the hills, Elias found himself standing by the corral, staring at the line of distant thunderheads. The world smelled of rain again, but this time it didn't feel like a curse. Inside, Tessa moved quietly about the cabin, the soft scrape of metal and wood mingling with the crackle of the fire. Elias watched her from the doorway. There was something about the way she carried herself, as though the world had broken her once, and she had learned how to walk with the cracks still showing. He thought of Mary again, of the shawl she'd left behind. Once he had believed his wife's death had ended his story, but now he wondered if it had only changed the language of it. The sky darkened. Crickets began their evening hymn. Tessa lit the lantern, its glow soft against her face. For the first time, Elias realized how young she was, younger than he'd guessed, yet her eyes held the weight of a life twice lived. He felt something shift inside him, subtle as the wind through the grass, a loosening of the knot he'd tied around his own heart. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked up from the hearth. "For what? For keeping the fire." Tessa's gaze softened. "It is what keeps us both alive," she said. He nodded. Outside, the thunder rolled low and distant. That night, long after she had gone to her cot, Elias sat awake listening to the rain's rhythm. He realized that her silence no longer unsettled him. It spoke of endurance, not absence. It was a kind of language, one that told him she had survived worse than loneliness, and that in her quiet, she carried both defiance and grace. And as the wind breathed through the cracks of the cabin, Elias Boone understood for the first time in years that silence could also mean peace. By late November, the wind changed its voice. It no longer carried the warm sigh of autumn, but a sharper, hungrier sound that slid through the canyons and rattled the cabin shutters like a restless spirit. Elias Boone could smell the snow before. He saw it, that faint metallic edge on the air, clean and cold. The sky bruised over in the west, and the last light bled out behind the mountains. He fastened the corral gate, threw an extra tarp over the feed, and turned toward the cabin just as the first flakes began to fall. Tessa was already inside, stirring a pot of beans on the stove. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she always did, yet tonight her movements were slower, her eyes watchful. The horses had been restless since morning. Even the land seemed to hold its breath. "Storm's comin' hard," Elias said, stamping the snow from his boots. "Could be 2 days, maybe more." She nodded. adding another stick of wood to the fire. "The wind speaks," she murmured. "It says we stay close." He gave a short, dry laugh. "Ain't much choice." By dusk, the world outside disappeared. The storm swallowed everything: the fence line, the cottonwoods, the shape of the hills. Snow pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the wind wailed through the chimney like it carried all the voices of the dead. Elias and Tessa moved the table away from the draft and set another log to burn. The flames threw long shadows on the walls, turning the small cabin into a flickering cocoon of orange light and sound. For hours, neither spoke. She hummed under her breath, a tune soft and winding, words lost to time. Elias sat in his chair and listened. Something about the melody settled the air. It was unlike any hymn or lullaby he'd known. It carried the rhythm of rivers, the patience of stones. "What's that song?" he asked after a while. "It has no name," she said. "It belongs to the night." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the fire. The crackle filled the pauses between her words. "My wife used to sing," he said finally, "only when she thought I wasn't listening." Tessa looked up, her face calm, unreadable. "She'd sing while she worked," he went on. "Couldn't carry a tune to save her life, but I'd sit outside and listen anyway. After the fever took her, the house got too quiet. I thought I'd gotten used to it." He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was not empty. It was something close to respect. "The earth keeps her," Tessa said gently. "She's buried by the cottonwoods," Elias replied, "near the dry creek bed. I still talk to her sometimes." Tessa stirred the pot again, slow and steady. "The ones we love still here, just not the way we expect." Elias let out a long breath. The wind roared outside, as though testing the walls of their fragile refuge. The hours stretched. The fire sank low, then flared again. When the roof began to drip, a thin stream from the storm's heavy burden, they rose without a word. Together they fetched buckets, then climbed the ladder to the loft. Up there, under the slanting boards and flickering lamplight, they worked side by side. Elias held the lantern, while Tessa packed clay and cloth into the cracks. Snow hissed as it melted against the roof, leaking cold into their fingers. Their hands brushed once, rough against rough. Neither spoke. The air between them pulsed with something fragile, uncertain. It wasn't desire, not yet, but recognition. When they climbed down, the fire had dimmed to coals. Tessa knelt to stoke it again, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. Elias caught a glimpse of a small scar along her collarbone, pale against her skin, shaped like a crescent. He looked away. "You should rest," he said quietly. "So should you." He took his chair by the fire again, the rifle across his lap out of habit. She curled on her cot, facing the hearth. The wind howled and moaned, shaking the cabin door, but inside it was warm, warmer than it had any right to be. At some point, Elias dozed. In his dream, he saw Mary standing by the cottonwoods, her hair moving like tall grass in the wind. She turned, and her face became Tessa's. He woke with a start. The fire burned low to embers. The storm still raged. He listened, not to the wind, but to the space between its gusts. Somewhere out there, beyond the sound of snow, came another noise, faint, deliberate, out of place. A creak. Then another. He rose, moving to the frosted window. The glass was blurred with ice, but beneath the swirl of flakes, he saw it. A shadow moving near the corral. A horse. A rider, maybe. Watching. He reached for his rifle, the motion automatic, his breath visible in the cold air. But the shape was gone. Only the storm remained. He waited a long time before setting the rifle back down. When morning came, the storm had passed. The world outside lay buried beneath a hush of white. Snow draped every fence post and tree, smoothing the land until it looked like a place reborn. Tessa was already outside, her boots sinking deep into the drift. She moved easily through it, the shawl bright against the pale world. Elias followed her to the corral. The horses were alive, snorting steam into the crisp air. But near the edge of the fence, half covered by new snow, Elias found what he'd feared: hoofprints. Not from his stock. Too large, too fresh. He crouched, running his hand along the print. "Someone was here," he murmured. Tessa stood beside him. Her expression didn't change. "You saw?" "Maybe. Hard to tell in the dark." She knelt, studying the tracks. One horse, not far, watching. He looked toward the ridge, where sunlight cut through the mist. "Why?" "Because of me," she said. Their eyes met. Her calm, his troubled. The wind shifted, lifting the edge of her shawl. For a heartbeat, he saw something in her gaze that was not fear, but acceptance, as if she had known the rider would come all along. Elias straightened slowly. "Then we'll be ready next time." Tessa gave a small nod. "The storm ends," she said, "but it never leaves." He didn't understand her meaning, not fully. But as he looked across the endless whiteness, he felt it. That same uneasy quiet. The stillness after the world has tested you and found you wanting. The cabin waited behind them, smoke curling from its chimney, a fragile promise against a vast, unforgiving sky. And though Elias Boone could not name it, something inside him had shifted during the long storm. The silence between them was no longer born of distrust, but of recognition. Two souls tempered by wind and fire, learning at last to share the same small warmth. The snow melted slow, leaving the earth bruised and soft beneath the hooves. By the first week of December, the storm's silence gave way to dripping eaves, restless wind, and mud that clung to every bootstep. The air carried a scent of thaw and unease, the kind that makes animals restless and men thoughtful. Elias Boone saddled his horse and told Tessa he'd ride into town for supplies. She only nodded, her face unreadable. He watched her a moment longer than necessary before turning toward the trail. The ride was long and quiet. The land, scrubbed clean by snow, seemed both renewed and foreign. He passed the cottonwoods where Mary lay, the grave marked by a simple cross. He tipped his hat, murmuring something that wasn't quite a prayer. Then he rode on. Town sat small and windblown at the valley's edge, a scatter of wood and iron trying to look permanent against the vast sky. The saloon's piano was silent when he pushed through the doors. The few men inside huddled around whiskey and talk. He ordered coffee, his old habit, and took a seat near the stove. It didn't take long to hear it. Two ranchers spoke in low voices nearby, their tones half curious, half fearful. "Apache riders seen out by the ridge again," one said. "Scouts, maybe. Word is the chief's daughter's gone missing." "Yahola's girl," Elias froze mid-sip. The coffee burned down his throat. "They say she was taken," the other man continued. "By her own folk or by traders, no one knows. But the chief's none too pleased. Some talk of blood for blood." Elias set the cup down with care. The sound of it meeting wood seemed louder than the wind outside. He stayed just long enough to keep from drawing attention, then rose, left coin on the counter, and walked out into the cold. The truth rode back with him like a second shadow. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the ridges, painting the snowmelt in bronze. Smoke curled from the chimney. Tessa had kept the fire. He dismounted slowly, every muscle in his back tight as rope. Inside, she was mending a tear in one of his shirts. Her hands paused when she saw him. "You went to town," she said softly. "I did." He shut the door, leaned his rifle against the wall. "Heard some things while I was there." She waited. About Apache riders. About a chief's daughter, one gone missing. Her eyes lifted to his. She didn't flinch. "And now you think you know who I am." He stepped closer, voice low but steady. "I think I deserve to hear it from you." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Finally, she set the needle down and folded her hands. "My father is Yahola," she said. You heard true. Elias's stomach turned. Then why in God's name did those men— They lied, she said simply. My father sent me to the settlers as a gesture. To learn their ways, to see if peace could be more than a word. I was to live under fair trade with respect, but the traders sold that promise for profit. They said I owed them, that I must serve to repay debt I never made. Her voice did not tremble, but it carried a quiet fire that made Elias feel smaller than he'd felt in years. He turned toward the window, where the light was fading to blue. And you stayed, he murmured. You could have run. She rose, standing as straight as any queen. If I ran, it would prove them right, that we are faithless, that peace is a fool's wish. So I stayed, to see what kind of man you were. The words hit harder than a bullet. Elias's throat tightened. You think I'm one of them? I think, she said, you don't yet know which side of yourself you belong to. The room felt smaller. The fire crackled low, throwing restless light across their faces. Elias paced once, then stopped near the table, hands gripping the edge until his knuckles whitened. I never asked for this, he said finally. Nor did I. Her calmness stung more than anger would have. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the stranger he'd taken in, but the weight she bore. The lines of endurance around her eyes, the faint tremor of exhaustion in her fingers. She had trusted him with her presence, even when she had no reason to. The shame of it settled in his chest like stone. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what they did. For what I didn't see. Tessa's gaze softened, but she didn't move closer. Sorry as wind, she replied. It passes. What matters is what it moves. Elias sank into the chair by the fire, the old wood creaking under him. He felt years older than he had that morning. If your father comes for you, he will, she said. When the snows melt, he looked up sharply. And if he finds you here with me, then he will see the truth of your heart. Her words cut through the air, calm and certain. The fire flared, reflecting in her eyes like twin embers. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the loose boards on the shed. Elias stared into the flames, his thoughts turning dark and restless. What kind of man was he now? One who'd taken what wasn't his, or one who'd tried too late to make it right? He remembered Mary's voice, soft and sure, telling him once that good men aren't born, they're tested. He wondered how many times he'd failed the test without knowing. When he finally looked up, Tessa had turned toward the window, her silhouette outlined by the fire's glow. The distance between them was small, just a few feet of rough floorboards, yet it felt like a canyon neither could cross. Still, something had changed. Beneath the tension and guilt, another truth had begun to grow. Small, stubborn, unspoken. Trust, or maybe forgiveness, finding root in unlikely soil. She turned slightly, catching his gaze. The storm taught us something, she said. Even when the world shakes, the roof can hold, if both hands mend it. Elias let out a slow breath. Then I'll keep mending, he said. The faintest ghost of a smile touched her lips. We both will. That night, as the fire burned low and the moon rose pale over the valley, Elias lay awake listening to the rhythm of her breathing from across the room. The storm had ended, but a different kind of weather filled the cabin. A quiet tension charged with truths too heavy to name. He realized then that the hardest battles weren't fought with rifles, but with conscience. And for the first time in years he prayed, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to be the man the storm believed he could be. The wind had turned mean again by nightfall, hissing through the bare mesquite and rattling the shutters like old bones. The fire in the hearth burned low, throwing restless light across the cabin walls. Tessa sat mending a torn blanket, while Elias readied the lanterns for another long, cold night. There was peace between them now, a fragile kind born of shared silence and unspoken forgiveness. But peace in that country never lasted long. The first sound came soft, a distant hoofbeat beneath the wind. Then another. Elias froze, eyes narrowing toward the door. Tessa looked up, needle pausing mid-stitch. She heard it too. Stay here, he murmured. He crossed the room and took down his rifle, checking the chamber by feel. The sound outside grew clearer, the uneven rhythm of horses, the murmur of men's voices. A knock came, sharp, insistent. Elias opened the door, only part way. 3 figures stood beyond, shadows against starlit snow. Their breath steamed white in the cold. "Well, look at that," said the man in front, grinning through yellowed teeth. "Boone, ain't it?" "Been a while since we did business." Elias's grip tightened on the door. He knew them, the traders from the deal months back. "Men who dealt in horses, liquor, and lies? What do you want?" The leader tilted his head, eyes glinting with mean amusement. "We come for what's ours. That Apache woman. You got something belongs to us." Elias felt the heat rise in his chest. "She doesn't belong to anyone," the man chuckled. "You think so? We made a trade, Boone. That makes her property." Elias stepped outside then, pulling the door shut behind him. The snow crunched under his boots. "You best ride on," he said evenly. "Ain't no trade worth dying for." The laughter died in the man's throat. "You threatening me?" "I'm telling you plain," Elias replied. "You ain't taking her," one of the others spat into the snow. "You got soft, Boone. Always figured that widow's heart of yours was going to rot you from the inside." Elias raised the rifle. "Go," the leader's grin twisted. "Then we'll take her over your body." The night exploded. Gunfire tore through the stillness, the flashes white and brutal against the dark. Elias dropped to one knee behind the trough, returning fire. Bullets splintered the porch rail, whined past his head. The smell of black powder and snow filled the air. Inside the cabin, Tessa had already grabbed his revolver from the table. She flung the door open just as one of the men rounded the corner. A single shot rang out, and he fell into the snow, his blood black under starlight. Elias fired again, catching the second man in the leg. The third fled into the trees, cursing, the echo of hooves fading into the canyon. Silence followed, heavy, trembling. Elias stood slowly, breath clouding in the cold. Then pain tore through his left arm. He looked down and saw blood seeping through his sleeve, dark and steady. Tessa was beside him in an instant. "Sit!" she commanded, voice sharp with urgency. He didn't argue. Inside, she pushed him into the chair by the fire and tore the fabric from his coat. The wound ran deep, a grazing bullet along the upper arm, but it bled freely. Without hesitation, she ripped a strip from her red shawl, the same one she had worn since the day they met. Her fingers were steady as she bound the wound, pulling the cloth tight. Elias hissed at the sting. "You'll ruin it." "It's only cloth," she said. "Your flesh." Her tone left no room for protest. The firelight painted her face in golden shadow, her eyes bright with fierce purpose. Elias watched her hands move, quick, sure, strong. When she finished, she met his gaze. "You should rest." "Can't," he murmured. "Pain'll set in soon." "Need to stay awake." Tessa nodded. She moved behind him, her touch light on his shoulder. Then, to his quiet surprise, she began to braid his hair, slow, deliberate motions that felt both intimate and ancient. "It will keep you awake," she said softly. "And it is our way, to braid the hair of those we protect." Elias closed his eyes. Her fingers moved through his hair, weaving strength into each twist. The pain in his arm dulled beneath the rhythm of her touch. "I never asked you your full name," he said after a while, voice rough. "Tessa Na'dine," she replied. "Daughter of Yahola," he breathed out slowly. "I've heard that name before, even before all this." "He's a man of peace." "He is," she said. "But peace costs much. My husband died in battle for it." Elias turned slightly, his voice low. "I'm sorry," she shook her head. "He died as he chose, a warrior. I carry his spirit in my scars, but tonight I carried yours too." The words settled between them like a prayer. The fire crackled, sparks drifting upward. Elias felt the warmth of it against his face, the ache of life pulsing through him. For the first time in years, he felt something stir that wasn't grief or guilt. It was quieter, like the faint thaw of spring beneath frozen ground. When she finished the braid, she rested her hand on his shoulder a moment longer than needed. "You will live," she said. He nodded. "Thanks to you." She moved to stoke the fire, her shawl now torn, one end stained with his blood. Outside, dawn had begun to rise. pale light pushing through the mist. The snow shimmered like ash under the first touch of sun. Elias watched her silhouette against the fire, strong, steady, and impossibly human. In that moment, she was no longer the woman he'd been given, nor the chief's daughter he'd wronged. She was something rarer, proof that redemption could be shared, not earned alone. He spoke her name softly, as if testing its shape. Tessa Na'dine. She looked back, eyes warm despite the long night. Sleep now, Elias Boone. The world will wait. He closed his eyes, the fire's heat breathing against his skin. The cabin smelled of smoke, blood, and something clean, something like renewal. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky burned gold where the sun broke over the ridges, and for the first time in years, Elias believed that dawn might still belong to him. Winter loosened its grip at last. The snow withdrew into the gullies, leaving behind dark veins of earth and grass sharp with green. The rivers swelled, singing again after months of silence. And on the Boone ranch, the world smelled of thawed soil and smoke, of life daring to return. Elias stood at the fence line, mending rails the wind had torn loose. His arm still carried a faint ache from the bullet wound, but the pain had become a companion of sorts. Something to remind him that he was still here, still mending what had once been broken. Behind him, Tessa hung freshly washed clothes on the line. Her movements were calm, deliberate, the wind catching at the loose strands of her braid. The red shawl, torn, mended, blood-marked, fluttered like a banner between them. It had been months since the night of gunfire. No riders had returned since, no trouble had come their way. The world seemed to have exhaled, settling into uneasy peace. Yet both knew the silence could not last forever. Spring carried change on its back. That morning, as Elias saddled his horse to ride the southern fence, the earth trembled faintly beneath the hooves of distant riders. He turned his head and saw them, a line of figures cresting the ridge, sunlight glinting on their spears and horsehide. The riders moved with purpose, their formation disciplined, graceful, inevitable. Tessa had already seen them. She stood still in the yard, her eyes steady as the wind tugged at her hair. "They've come," she said quietly. Elias's throat tightened. "Your father?" She nodded. "And his men." He felt something hollow open inside him, not fear, but resignation. The time for reckoning had come, and he knew in his bones that it was hers to claim, not his. The riders approached slowly, their horses stamping in the damp soil. At their head rode Chief Yahola, tall, grave, his hair streaked with silver and bound in a braid that reached his chest. His gaze was sharp, measuring. Behind him rode warriors, silent as the mountains that framed them. Elias removed his hat. "Chief Yahola," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've come for your daughter," Yahola dismounted with quiet dignity. His face betrayed no anger, no haste. He looked first at Tessa, studying her as though seeing her for the first time, then at Elias. The silence between them stretched long enough to feel sacred. Tessa stepped forward. "Father," she said, her voice calm but full. "You sent me to learn if peace could live in a white man's home?" Yahola's eyes softened. "And what have you learned?" She looked toward Elias, then back to her father. "That it can, if the man has known pain." Elias felt the words strike something deep in him, old as grief and tender as hope. He looked down, unable to meet either of their eyes. Yahola regarded him for a long moment. "You fought for her," he said, his tone not accusing, merely observing. "I did," Elias said quietly. "But I also failed her, at first. I took what wasn't mine. I'd ride away now if it brings her peace." Tessa turned sharply toward him. "No," he blinked. "What?" She spoke to her father in Apache, her voice low and rhythmic, the syllables rolling like wind through reeds. Elias couldn't understand the words, but he felt their weight. Yahola listened without interruption, then nodded once, solemnly. When Tessa turned back, her eyes shone with something both fierce and tender. "You kept your word when others broke theirs," she said. "My father sees that. So do I," Elias swallowed hard. "You should go with him. You belong to your people." "I do," she said. "But I also belong to the life I choose. And I choose this." Yahola's gaze flicked between them, seeing something wordless that passed through the air like light through dust. Then he placed a hand over his heart and inclined his head, a gesture of respect, not surrender. "Peace stands here," the chief said. His voice was quiet, but carried across the valley. "Let no man break it." He mounted his horse again. The riders turned without command, their formation parting like mist. The sound of hooves faded down the slope, swallowed by wind and distance, until only the rustle of grass remained. Elias stood motionless, hat in hand, unsure what to do with the sudden emptiness left behind. When he finally turned to Tessa, she was watching the horizon, her expression calm. "He gave his blessing," she said softly. Elias nodded, though words failed him. He felt both small and whole, as if the land itself had forgiven him. That evening, the sun fell slow and wide across the valley, turning the cottonwoods to gold. Elias sat on the porch in his old rocking chair, his rifle resting beside him. The boards beneath his boots creaked with each gentle sway. Tessa came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and settled onto the step below, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The smell of roasted beans mingled with the sweet scent of new grass. Neither spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt like peace. Elias watched the horizon where the riders had vanished. The sky was bruised purple now, clouds trailing like old smoke. "Reckon the world might finally be done testing us," he said at last. Tessa smiled faintly. "The world never stops testing. It only gives you moments to rest between storms." He chuckled softly. "You sound like my wife used to." "She was wise," Tessa replied. "She was," he said, his voice low. "You are too." She turned toward him, eyes catching the last of the sunset. "Then maybe she sent me." Elias didn't answer. He just nodded, the lump in his throat too large for words. As the light faded, a chill crept in. Without thinking, Tessa rose, removed her shawl, and draped it over his shoulders. The fabric still smelled faintly of smoke and sagebrush. Elias let it rest there, a weight both light and sacred. "Keep it," she said. "You've earned it." He shook his head. "No, it's yours. It was my mother's before me," she said. "She said a shawl should warm the one who needs it most." Elias looked at her then, really looked, and felt something unspoken settle between them. Gratitude. Trust. The quiet kind of love that doesn't need to be named. In the distance, faint but distinct, came the low thrum of drums, far off, perhaps carried by the wind from the Apache encampment miles away. The sound was neither mournful nor triumphant. It was steady, alive, eternal. Elias closed his eyes, letting the rhythm blend with the creak of the rocking chair, the hiss of the cooling fire, the quiet heartbeat of a land finally at rest. When he opened them again, dusk had deepened into night. The stars had come out one by one, scattered across the sky like blessings. He took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through him. "Home," he said softly, not as a question, but as a truth. Tessa looked up at him from the step below and nodded once. "Home," she echoed. The rocking chair moved, the rifle rested, and the wind carried the sound of distant drums, not of war, but of life continuing. And for the first time in many years, Elias Boone smiled into the dark, knowing the land and his heart had finally come full circle.